wasn't illegal being accidentally sucked into censorship as well? Well, joining me now is Matthew Lesh, the head of research at the Adam Smith Institute, who has been poring over this bill for many, many months. Now, Matthew, thank you for joining me on the show today. Who is right there? We heard a number of experts say that, on the one hand, this bill is incredibly necessary to protect people and from various ne'er-do-wells online, but on the other hand, this could completely disrupt the internet as we know it.
Look, I'm quite frightened by what the government's proposed bill will do to our online freedoms. The state is creating a framework in which it will be able to instruct private companies not only to remove illegal content, which can lead to excessive censorship of legal speech, but also within the bill, the government is creating a duty of care which will be defined to include trying to prevent any manner of psychological harms as defined later. So what that practically means is the state having the power to instruct private companies to remove legal speech. We are massively reimagining the role of the state when it comes to our ability to speak freely. And you can just think about some examples around today. We have controversial issues, thinking about trans rights or immigration, where a lot of people feel harmed, where they feel like they're psychologically damaged by discussion about these issues. Will the state be putting pressure onto companies to remove that kind of content? There's a lot of discussion around today in these committees about disinformation. Well, although it sounds really easy to try and determine what is true and what isn't, as we've seen throughout COVID, what is true isn't necessarily clear. And sometimes authorities, let's say the World Health Organization, telling us in January last year that there's no human-to-human transmission of COVID, because that's what China said, or the government advising against masks, or the government doing all sorts of claptrap about testing and tracing, whatever else it may be. We have to be very precious about our freedoms and very worried when the state is creating extremely broad, undefined powers to censor what is legal speech.
We saw very concerningly during the 2020 US presidential election that a lot of information that turned out to be true was actually censored by tech companies when it came to what Joe Biden's children had been up to and various laptops and seized information there. To what extent are tech companies actually doing this anyway without this legislation?
Well, look, the tech companies are under a lot of pressure, including from the government. It's notable that when they removed Donald Trump from Twitter, it was after he'd lost power. They knew the Democrats were coming. They knew they wanted to avoid the risk of regulation. So in some ways, the company is jumping ahead and being, in my opinion, excessively censorious of legal speech. But if you want to turn that up to full blast, if you want to put online censorship and big tech censorship to the extreme, that's what the UK government is doing through the Online Safety Bill. It's effectively saying if they don't do things like that, they could be fined. They could have massive fines. You've got to understand that these platforms have no incentive to host controversial speech, especially if it's something that could lead to these kind of legal liabilities through Ofcom, through the Secretary of State. We also got to think about the kind of structures we're creating. Even if you assume the current government would act appropriately, that Ofcom will be reined in properly, there's little reason to imagine that this couldn't go wrong in future. That a future government couldn't make certain things illegal. If Jeremy Corbyn had won the last election, he had this framework in place, it's easily imaginable that his Secretary of State could be outlawing all sorts of online speech simply because it doesn't fit with Labour's worldview of what should be legal. So
remind me, is it the Secretary of State or is it Ofcom who would be able to define what is harmful content and therefore unable to be presented on the internet?
Well, look, it's a conspiracy of the two. So Ofcom has the powers to write the specific codes of conduct that then, if the tech companies don't follow, they could be potentially fined. Although they do that under effectively the instruction and oversight of the Secretary of State. So the Secretary of State sets what the priorities are. The Secretary of State can approve or disapprove the codes of conduct. Now, there is some parliamentary oversight. So the codes of conduct about, let's say, how Facebook or Twitter should deal with disinformation or hate speech or whatever it may be, that will have to be laid before Parliament, but the mechanism there is quite weak. It's just laid for 40 days, and presuming Parliament doesn't vote on it, and they don't vote on most pieces of regulation, they're just allowed to sweep through. So it'll be between Ofcom and the Secretary of State to decide what kind of content is allowable.
It sounds like it's a bit of a mess, and the big question here is who defines harm? How is that to be decided? Because everyone ultimately has a different definition. Well, Matt Lesh, thank you very much for joining us on the briefing this afternoon on GB News. We've got to go to a quick break now, but coming up, post-Brexit trade, British lamb can now be sold in the United States. We'll hear from the experts.